Basin Focal projects were a set of 10 projects initiated in about 2004, 2005 by the Challenge program to understand what the linkages were between food and water and poverty. That was our goal there. We had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we couldn't really put the story together, and so it was decided to have a reasonably comprehensive view with detailed analysis in basins. 10 basins were chosen, 2 in Latin America, 4 in Africa and 4 in Asia. It generated a huge amount of insight, new insight into what was really linking water, food and development. I suppose the first thing that was unique was that it was the first time we had a view from 3 continents. So we had a very good insight of really what was happening, and these 10 basins, they vary tremendously in characteristic from some of the basins in Africa, the situation where basically they're very, very early point in development, strongly agricultural, through to what you might call transitional basins, where there's a move away from agriculture, towards those such as the Andes or San Francisco or Yellow River in China, where really non-farm activities are beginning to dominate. And so the challenges put upon these basins is very different, and the characteristics and the opportunities within the basins are extremely different. So for the first time we got a reasonably comprehensive view of the situation, plus we got enough detail of what actually links these things within basins. So for the first time, I'd say, we understand in a general way what are the linkages between water, food systems and development processes, and that is new. I'd say the first key message that we'd have is that you need to understand the range of support that river basins provide development. So don't focus too quickly on any one aspect. If you do that, you'll miss too many things. So that's the first message we have, is that river basins support development in a number of different ways. In some cases, food is most important. Other cases, energy is more important. In other cases, it's something completely different. And overall, don't forget that the river basin is an ecosystem that supports people. So if you damage that, you're going to head for long-term trouble. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd say. The other thing that we found was that the potential for increased use of those ecosystems is quite substantial. That in many cases, the ecosystem use, or the productivity of that use, is extremely low, maybe 10% of the potential. So I mean, that raises questions in itself, why it is so low. But that also suggests there's huge scope for improvement there by increasing water productivity, the beneficial use of water. And in this, the real big one is rain-fed water productivity. In most of the rain-fed systems, we found very low water productivity. In other words, there's substantial scope for development. The third key message, I'd say, was that we understood that these systems are shared by many different groups of people, and yet the sharing arrangements are often relatively weak. And so that is a major area for improvement. You can imagine this picture. Development is going to exploit certain aspects of the river basin ecosystem. They're going to develop more rapidly, but that will have consequences to other groups and other parts of the ecosystem. So how are those consequences going to be taken into account, and how our society is going to ensure that long-term damage doesn't occur to the ecosystem and to other people who rely on it? So that's the third one. And I'd say the fourth main message coming out of that is that in terms of institutions that manage all of these things together, what are the institutional arrangements, and are these really capable of supporting that kind of development? And we found, well, virtually all teams in all basins reported institutional fragmentation. That is, there was a lack of institutions to actually support the collective use of these resources. So that's a major human and political development that needs to be exploited. Okay. So, for instance, with respect to institutional arrangements, for example, we found that, or the team in the Nile found that ministries of agriculture tend to be concerned with food, not concerned so much with water. Ministries who are concerned with water or with hydropower do not have reference to food systems. Often ministries for development or social development will not have a good contact with that. So instantly you've got problems of fragmentation of ministries, fragmentations of institutions that will prevent a more holistic view that is probably necessary for long-term planning. That's what I'm saying. I mean, ministries have to operate within their own institutional boundaries, but at the same time, somebody needs to take a more holistic view. Who is that going to be? The bright spots are where development has really maximized use of the resources, and we found that in some parts, for example, some parts of the Ganges, in the Punjab, and in some parts of the Yellow River, there were incredibly highly productive systems. The water productivity was probably about as high as you could imagine it, which meant that the system had actually developed towards its potential, and that points towards the massive scope for improvement elsewhere. But of course, that development itself risks running into a hotspot. If you develop the system without taking account of the consequences for the system itself or for other people within that system, then that can lead to problems of water scarcity, where one group of people are actually taking the resources of another, or where development has actually moved the system into a position that can be viewed as unsustainable. Those are hotspots. So we found those again in the Ganges or in the Indus, in the Yellow River, which has some very well documented cases where the system had effectively developed beyond the capacity of the river to support it, and also areas such as the Limpopo, where there were problems of historical allocation rights that were leading to some political conflict there that were being adjusted there. So those could be regarded as hotspots as well. So you can see there's a balance between a bright spot in which development actually proceeds towards high productivity, towards hotspots where the thing has actually moved beyond the level at which it can be sustained and adjustment is needed. By far the biggest picture, though, is really one of what you might call dead spots, which is where the system is performing at a very low level of activity. And there it's a simple development issue, where the system is just not operating at any level of activity which can be seen to be supporting the development demands being put upon it. And that situation is found widely in African basins, in the 4 African basins that were analysed, but it also occurred in parts of the other basins, including, for example, the Ganges, which generally has an extremely high level of demand, extremely high pressure, and some of these bright spots as well as hot spots. But even in the Ganges, you can find areas where the agricultural system is operating at a pretty low level of productivity. So, you know, these are signs for optimism as well as signs of concern. And I guess what you could say is that is the intention of overall agricultural development, is to try to lift the level of activity of many of these agricultural systems, and that is really representing the scope for improvement. That's the big opportunity.
Do you have any specific examples of where, you know, how much productivity can be improved?
Well, if you're looking at
African basins,
if you're looking at situations where productivity is less than 10% of its potential, then a doubling of that seems quite reasonable, seems quite achievable, and that has huge consequences for food security. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but what I am saying is that those are mainly rain-fed systems, so the consequences on other users of water within those river basin systems are relatively tolerable. They're easy to cope with. But what is needed is actually a full development of the system. Here we're looking at situations in which we had problems of inputs, problems of access to finance, problems of institutional failure, problems of difficult access to markets. So I'm not saying that it's it's an easy thing to achieve, and there are many people actually looking at that. What I'm saying is that if that can be achieved, then therein lies the major opportunity for solving the food security problem without handing over a major problem of water security at the same time. I didn't say that water scarcity wasn't an issue. What I say is that it's not the only issue, and in many cases it's not the main issue. And in actual fact, the analyses from the basin found an often quite weak statistical relationship between water availability and measured levels of poverty. And the reason for that is that there are many other things that will influence whether people are able to support themselves adequately, not just water scarcity, although water scarcity can be a problem. So we have a massive capacity waiting there in the system for agricultural systems to develop and to support people in their livelihoods. And there are a range of different issues that there. General development issues. I mean, do you want me to list them? It would be a pretty long list. But what we are saying is that there appears to be the capacity available within the global ecosystem to support food and water needs for the foreseeable future. But that in developing the system to meet those needs, what we're saying is that you need to take account of the fact that when you develop one part of the system, it's likely to have consequences to other parts of the system. But there is capacity there to meet foreseeable needs, yes. And I think actually the story is changing somewhat as when people look at the data elsewhere, they're realizing that there is the capacity to meet demands. But the question is, how is that going to occur? That's a tricky question, but I would say, for me, I would say it would be good to take this new information and do something with it. And I would say the first thing that we need to do is get a better handle on what is driving change. For example, what impact is global climate change going to have on these basins? How are those going to be developed? How is general economic development likely to drive change in these particular basins? We know some of the consequences of not taking into account this. We know some of the consequences of not taking into account the full range of change, but we don't have a very detailed picture of what drives change in basins, and that would be very helpful. The other thing I think that would be particularly helpful would be to take a more experimental approach, I guess, and try and understand what can we do to support the development of institutions to help manage these changes. We can see from the Andes, for example, and in other places, that the payment for ecosystem services has some viability. Okay, what else can we think of to actually support processes like that that enable different groups of people to come to mutually beneficial arrangements about sharing of collective resources? And I would say we've only just touched the surface on that. So there's huge scope, I would have thought, for, if you like, green. We talk about the green economy, but also we're talking maybe about the blue economy. That it's much more than pricing. It's more about how can we learn to share these collectively used ecosystem resources in ways that really support development.